What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 119, and I'm the co-host of the show, Kyle Lanslone, joined right now by Will Porter, the other co-host. Will, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing great, and I'm excited for this interview we got coming up.
Yeah, so me and Will just talked with Alan Mosley for a long time. How much fun was it to talk to Alan? Just to talk with him off air and on air. But we also recorded a really good episode with him. There might have been some great bonus content there, but we didn't get that. But we do have a great episode with him talking about his show, talking about our takes on the potential lab leak of the Wuhan virus, and also about a really great recent episode and upcoming project of his show on like prosecutorial malpractice and how people end up in jail for long periods of time when they're completely innocent. So a lot of great stuff on today's show. I'm really excited about this interview. I think everybody's gonna love it. Will, make sure you check out Alan's work. He is really good at marketing, so all of his usernames are Alan Mosley TV, but I'll go ahead and put a link to his Facebook, YouTube account in the show notes page, as well as a couple recent episodes of the show or episodes of the show that we had talked about.
Yeah.
Will, anything else about the interview?
No, I mean Alan's a really interesting guy. He's got real range to his interests and his I don't know expertise, but it was a great interview. I
Yep.
look forward
All
to
right. So you're all going to enjoy it. Make sure you subscribe to the show, YouTube or Odysee. Any of the Facebook, MeWe, Twitter handle is @con_interest. You find the show at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive. And then you could support the show by supporting our sponsor and getting yourself some great CBD products at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Will, let me tell you, I've been enjoying the nice weather that we have right now in Colorado, doing a lot of outdoor stuff, but I really do get sore these days after I do some outdoor stuff. I think it's from a year of not doing quite as much and also just getting older. And so I've been using the sports lotion that they have at Paloma Verde, and it's excellent. It works in like 15 minutes. It doesn't smell bad at all. And one of the other great things about it is I've been using the same bottle for like a month now, and so it's lasted a very long time. So I really recommend it. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, when you check out, and it'll get you 25% off when you spend $75 or more. All right, everyone. Me and Will Porter are here with the Libertarian Late Night Talk Show host, Alan Mosley. Alan, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing good. I'm underdressed though because you've got the WikiLeaks shirt and I've just got plain Jane white shirt. So I've been put to shame already.
Well, you usually have the free Assange hat to go with it, and Will has a Rothbard, our Ron Paul Libertarian Institute shirt on. So we're lacking a little bit tonight too, but that's all right. Will, how you doing tonight?
doing great, man. I'm ready to get into this. I've been looking forward to this show. I'm glad to have you on, Alan. Thank you for joining us.
Well,
We,
I want to say that whatever we do tonight's only part one, because I have it on good authority that It's Too Late is going to have a couple of these guys on in later this month. So,
where'd you hear that? Who told you that?
I think technically it was Will that told me that because Kyle wants to have nothing to do with this garbage.
He's trying to distance himself. But yeah, we got a few topics we want to get into today. But before we do that, I want to hear a little bit about you and just background. And as far as I understand, you are a libertarian. You sort of identify as a market anarchist on the radical side. And like Kyle and I, you are also, very anti-war and non-interventionist. And that stuff's not super common. It's sort of a rare worldview. So how did you come to that stuff?
Well, I've when people have asked me that in the past, I used to tell them, "Oh, I'm deeply libertarian, and I came to it this way." I actually have gotten to the point I really don't use the L word much anymore, and it's not
Okay.
because I have changed. It's more that I just kind of have the acceptance that words and meanings and like that's how we communicate. And if a lot of people are using words to communicate a certain meaning or knowledge that you don't identify with or agree with, then you don't just get to put your feet down and draw your line and say, no, that's our word. It doesn't really work that way. So
Right.
I don't really use the word libertarian anymore. I've really gotten into the habit of just saying anarchist with no adjectives, which I know Michael Malice is really well known for saying. And for me, that comes from, I'm originally from Columbia, Tennessee, which is only known for two things. It's the home of James K. Polk, President Polk, and they are the mule capital of the world. So every year they have Mule Day in Columbia, Tennessee. So that's it. Well,
Wow.
it's known for those two things, and It's Too Late with Alan Mosley. That's it. And but growing up in the South, and my dad's side of the family in particular, and he was a little bit older than most people's fathers when I came along. So I have a lot of older relatives and cousins and things like that. So there's still a little bit of that flavor of old South. Like they're like one generation above me grew up in a family of like 10 on a farm working in the dust and that sort of thing. And so that kind of Southern anarchist tradition still existed at that time and bled over it. These were people who, don't answer questions from the census man, hang the no trespassing signs at the end of the fence and stuff like that. And I maybe not didn't understand the terminology at that time. Maybe I was not as obviously I wasn't as well read then, so maybe I couldn't explain to you philosophically what it meant. But these were people who had a default position of don't trust the state, don't trust the government, don't do anything for free, hide your income if you can, just complete lack of regard and respect for. I don't even want to say respect for authority because they didn't view the state as authority. They didn't view it. They didn't see as being under the state in any way, and so that was just the default position of a lot of the older kin in my family. And so for me, I just absorbed that kind of more as a young person absorbs values and morals. And then growing up decades later, then realizing, oh, well, there's actually philosophical underpinnings behind this other than shoot the census man. It's called anarchism and so on and so forth.
Right.
Yeah. So how'd you end up like doing a show? I mean, so first of all, you're a content creator who I think has been at it longer than I have, which now seems to actually be a meaningful statement. I've been producing shows or news roundups for four or 5 years now since
Mhm.
2016. So,
Yeah.
but you've been at it for a long time, and you have a really cool and unique concept to your show. You're not sit around and talk Rothbard the whole time. Like it's a show with segments. You got a cool like backdrop. You've done shows with live audiences. So how'd you end up doing libertarian-ish content creation? But more importantly, like why did you end up doing this particular like format?
Baffle them with bullshit. Isn't that the phrase that you're supposed to do? So for me, I had so for people that have followed me for a while, they know that It's Too Late with Alan Mosley, which is the late night show. It's very much a late night show, the same type of segments and pop culture and personal interest and things like that. But obviously we do talk about current events and whatnot as well, and have guests as well. That is the most recent iteration of the program. Before that, it was the gold standard with Alan Mosley. And the gold standard had every Tom Woods and Ron Paul and Lou Rockwell and Jeff Deist and everybody you can think of was on the gold standard. And that came about. So September 1st will be 4 years of having done this type of show. And before that, where that came about was a revival of a radio show that I had in Middle Tennessee back some years before. So I dropped out of college at 21 years old and opened a printing business, and I was running a printing business in Middle Tennessee for a number of years, and got invited to one of the local radio stations, WMRB, to come on the show and talk about politics. The station manager there was a big Ron Paul guy, and is about 2012 there about there, and said, "Hey, you should come on and just shoot the crap with us." And I did, and they were like, "Wow." We thought we were just getting a random local entrepreneur who was going to say, lower my taxes. We didn't realize we were going to get a guy saying, burn down the cathedral. And they actually very quickly said, well, how about instead of you just being a recurring guest, how about you just come in and do a thing? And so that was actually a sports station. It was like a Fox Sports network that had so many hours of local content. So imagine the people listening to like the Red Sox and Yankees, and then when the game is over, it goes to this just insane 20-something-year-old guy just going nuts about how every cop is a bastard and everything else. And that show was the gold standard. And so I revived that sometime later as a podcast and gone from there.
I see. And then that was later rebranded and sort of like, I can tell you really did up the production value. As people can see who are watching the video version, Alan's got a nice backdrop and a nice mic and stuff, a little more ritzy than what we do here on Conflicts of Interest. But you mentioned, I think you mentioned, maybe you didn't mention Ron Paul. You mentioned Jeff Deist. I'm curious how you got into that, like, because you mentioned sort of like growing up in a culture that's sort of conducive to liberty. But how did you get into this ideological libertarianism? Was it Ron Paul? Did that play a role?
So I definitely was a big Ron Paul fan. Yeah, I actually still have a Ron Paul 2008 bumper sticker on my car right now.
Nice.
I had some leftover bumper stickers from that campaign. Just a few were left over, so that when I get a new vehicle, bam, the new in hard quotations 2008 bumper sticker goes on it. And so I was a big Ron Paul guy. And so as a part of that, that was a little bit of a glimpse into, well, there's this community here. And I don't just mean anti-establishment voters, because there was a lot of those. Like, I think we can be honest here and say, look, if they voted for Ron Paul in 8 or 12 and then they turn around and voted for like Bernie in 2016, they obviously weren't deep philosophical libertarians. It was really more they were an anti-establishment voter. And like, I'd rather have an anti-establishment voter than a status quo voter.
Absolutely.
But so that introduced me to a little bit of, well, there are people here that this isn't their first rodeo. They've been here. We just didn't know them. And I got in, and I started to follow people like Tom Woods, and I had already, I already knew what the Mises Institute was. I had already read some of the books and realized, oh, there's this institute that has saved a lot of this literature, that publishes, has a wire and a blog and all that stuff, and already was familiar with Lou Rockwell and things like that. And so when the campaigns, and this is certainly not a knock on Ron Paul, but when the campaigns faded away and Ron Paul, obviously not a young man, is transitioning into retirement, it was like, well, what's left here? And the people that were much more interested in voting than reading were they just went on to the next candidate, right? Yeah. But there was something left. What is this thing that's left here? And it's the ideological underpinning that obviously didn't necessarily inform the whole movement per se, but it did inform a lot of the key people that made it possible. And so it's like, well, I got to find out, how did these people wind up here? How did Deist and Paul and Rockwell, and like, how did they get here and decide to try to, to take one last hurrah politically to try to reach people and all that. And so from there it was, okay, well, let's break it. And by the way, I'm a big audiobook guy. I'm somebody who likes to listen while I'm commuting or working or whatever. Yeah, and so it's like, okay, well, let me throw on, and then it's kind of like the transition of, well, let me look for something that's an hour long because I want to go ride my bike. Okay, Anatomy of the State. And it's like, okay, well, let me do something that's a few more hours than that, economics in one lesson. Okay, and then it kind of goes and goes and goes until eventually you're like, okay, I'm like halfway through this human action thing. Jesus Christ. but that's okay though, because even, we don't, like, I don't think, and I'm not trying to tell on you guys, but none of us here are like Nobel Prize winning economists or historians. I think is probably pretty safe to say. Yeah. But that's okay, because in the same sense, there are people like that who are very impressive thinkers, but they also have allowed their services and their intellect to be co-opted to spread things that we don't agree with, and vice versa. There's absolute brilliant people out there that are excellent communicators that did not academically go that direction, but they could, like, quote human action to you as if they'd read the Bible. And so again, it's like, I know these people exist. There's not a lot of them, but I know these people exist, and I don't want to just walk into a room with these people and say, yeah, taxation is theft. I agree, because I don't like taxes. No, you need to know why more than that. And so me being me, I know it makes me sound like an arrogant POS. But for me, it was I don't want to walk into that room and be like, well, I feel like this is the right thing to say or do, but I don't know why I think that. I want to know why, not just I understand that taxation is bad. No one likes paying taxes, but I got to know why that's bad. I got to know the economic reasons why this is bad. I got to know the moral and ethical reasons why this is bad. It's the same thing. I know you guys are absolute foreign policy champions. It's the same thing. It's that you can argue foreign policy and a neocon can yell back, but what about my 9/11? It's like, well, I'm not gonna sit here and tell you 9/11 didn't happen. We all saw it, but we got to understand morally why this is wrong, ethically why this is wrong, economically why this is wrong. It's not good enough to just have a soundbite. You got to understand why, because if all you can do is say, "Nuh-uh, my nap," that's not good enough.
Right.
Yep. Yeah. Although I will say Ron Paul's soundbite with Giuliani on explaining 9/11 is pretty solid. And really one of the things that converted me to the libertarian. I did want to mention that I think you also used to do a show called Postcards from Somalia with the great Sherry Valenteri. And I know that she has been a big supporter and promoter of your work. And I think has co-hosted a lot of stuff with you. And is I think Will would agree, one of our favorite people in the libertarian movement. Yeah. Just excellent. So what's it like working with Sherry?
So we used to, here's an old Mitch Hedberg joke. We used to do postcards from Somalia. We still do, but we used to too. So we had basically put postcards on a semi-permanent hiatus because doing It's Too Late obviously takes a lot out of me, and then trying to go keep the lights on and live my life, and then also do this show just makes postcards difficult, because I was also doing that at the same time as I was doing Sports Ball with Mike Maharrey, which was the exact same theme as It's Too Late. It wasn't a libertarian show. It was a sports talk show that just so happened to be hosted by us. So I guess you guys are getting the scoop. So we're getting ready to do a fresh episode of Postcards from Somalia.
Nice. I did not have that scoop, but I'm glad that's awesome. And another person that we've had on the show a bunch and who me and Will are absolutely huge fans of, Mike Maharrey, is a great guy, and everybody, I'm not sure I know he's doing the Shift Gold podcast still, but I'm not sure what else he's up to, if he's still putting out thoughts from my hairy head, but definitely the blog at the 10th Amendment Center. Will, anything else?
What was I going to say? Shit, I totally just lost my train of thought.
Well, I was going to say really quick about Maharrey. So he does do Godarchy. Godarchy is his show that delves into religious and spiritual things and which is very similar to our friend Stephen Rose, who does Anarcho-Christian, talking specifically to the Christian community of, not only it kind of that blowing away that Romans 13 nonsense of, no, you absolutely can be an anarchist and be a Christian. In fact, this is, again, it's understanding what this means beyond just bumper sticker slogans of there's a moral and ethical framework here that is logically consistent, and that's why I believe what I believe, and they're talking specifically to those communities. And so Mike does that. Also, and of course, obviously, still working with Michael Bolden at the 10th Amendment Center, which is one of the absolute highest integrity, best organizations in our community. And I'll since I brought him up, I'll give Mike one more plug. His most recent book, Constitution Owner's Manual. I know a lot of our people aren't big Constitution people, but it's not a matter of whether or not you believe in it. It's learning how to speak those people's language.
Right.
Yep. And so that you can communicate in a way that they understand, because a lot of the people that will argue, that will throw the Constitution in your face, they don't understand the Constitution. They're using it as they've weaponized it when they have no idea what they're talking about. And so Mike does a great service there. And I happen to know the guy who did the audiobook for that. So I think you should, for royalties reasons, you should go buy a copy of that.
I will actually throw a link in the show notes page on the old show before I rebranded it. Foreign Policy Focus. I interviewed Mike on that book. It was absolutely fantastic. It was right around the time it came out. Man, that was years ago. Crazy that we've been putting out content this long. Will,
I did remember what I wanted to say. I wanted to, just before we switch gears real quick, I wanted you to just give the premise of Postcards for Somalia to tease that new episode. What is the sort of the premise of that show?
So one of the things that Sherry and I wrestled with, because Postcards was absolutely our sort of variety off-color show where if we just had something that we wanted to get off our chest and talk about, and we wanted to talk about it perhaps in a little bit more 18 plus adult type of a way,
Yeah.
if you will, then I don't know what you guys' policy is on swearing. I don't think we covered that before we started the show, so I'm going to keep my mouth shut there. But that was kind of our outlet program. And sometimes we made funny little lists of things. Sometimes we made off-color jokes at the expense of, frankly, evil people that we don't like. So I'm not worried about their feelings.
Yeah.
But also, it also was an opportunity to talk about things in pop culture and not to run the risk of being one of these people who feels like you have to have a libertarian perspective on everything. Like, no, you can go watch Predator and not have a libertarian critique of Predator, right? Like, you can go do that. But with that said, we had decided, there's lots of things in movies or TV or novel, science fiction or fantasy or gaming or whatever, that this is actually a really interesting premise or a really interesting plot. And there's people out there that might find it just as interesting as us, but they don't look through it through the same lens that you and I would, because we would look through things through the lens of our own biases and belief systems. And so it's like, well, wouldn't it be interesting to take some of those things and talk about them and not be hitting people over the head of, oh, this is what libertarians think. Because look, I don't tell libertarians what to think, so I can't possibly tell you what libertarians think. I'll tell you what I think, and I'll let that stand for itself. So the first episode I believe we're doing is going to be talking about the finale of the Netflix series Castlevania. So Castlevania was an absolutely awesome animated series that Netflix did, and it's far and away the best video game adaptation that's ever been done in movie or
Really?
TV or whatever. It's dark, it's very adult, it's very serious. But the reason why we're doing it is not only do we just both like the show, so we're going to be geeks and talk about it, but in the very last episode of the last season, there's I don't want to give too much of it away, but there's a conversation between two of the characters in the show that are talking about the difference between strength and power and how strength can fight a war, but it can also build things. But power is a parasite that just lays eggs inside you and you want to feed it. And those are the words from one of the characters in the show. And it's like, wow, that's a very Jeffersonian thing that character just said. You think of the quote of, what may our wisdom grow with our strength and teach us that the less we use it, the greater it'll be. It's like that's basically what that character just said, but in different words. Now, do I think that the writers of Castlevania are libertarians? No, I don't. I don't think that. But isn't that though? Isn't that very synonymous with some of the things that we ascribe to and believe in? And I was like, well, I want to talk about that because that's exactly the kind of thing that now you may be sitting around with friends and go watch that on TV and be like, wow, that's actually a very positive message that I approve of. And that's good. It's nice to see things that, while obviously those characters, this is taking place in like 1600s Europe. Those characters aren't walking around talking about anarchism and liberty, but they shared a message that's very friendly to us. And that doesn't, and of course, anyone who knows anything about modern Hollywood and cinema, that doesn't happen very often. And
Right.
so we should applaud when we're like, oh wow, that's a very pro liberty, pro non-interventionist type of a message. We should talk about it.
Right, right. Just the general sort of themes. It doesn't have to be explicitly, Rothbardian or something for it to be sort of,
Yeah.
compatible with our worldview, for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you want to start off with a quote about Rothbard and what his interpretation would be? Just what a person
Mhm.
sees when they look at that. But while we're talking about Netflix, on I think your most recent show, or at least it was when I watched it,
Mhm.
you talked to I believe Susie Sherman is her
Suzanne
name.
Sherman. Yeah.
Yes. and you went through this documentary that's on Netflix that I have been telling people to watch for years. Will knows this. I've been plugging this on the show for years because when I watched it, it just gave such an insight into the criminal justice system. You know, now when I like when people talk about court cases, they're always like, the defense has, has to, or the prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. No, if you watch that, all these jurors, all the jurors say, well, the defense didn't put like forward an alternative story. And so I was like, so it doesn't, whatever and there's just so many great things in that documentary series. And also 2 more, Exhibit A and Confession Tapes, are both on Netflix, and also just great dives into that same kind of subject line. But talk a little bit about some of the cases from that documentary that really, like, I think I did like 2 shows on because I was raging for weeks after I watched that.
Well, so we're talking about the Innocence Files on Netflix, which is based on the cases that the Innocence Project, the organization, has undertaken to exonerate people who were innocent people who were found guilty by the system. But one of the things right off the jump that I really liked about the documentary is that it's about the people, or I should say, the cases are sort of the catalyst for the documentary. But it's not really about the cases per se. It's about, how did we get here? Why are we sitting here talking about an innocent person being in jail? Well, let's actually talk about how this poor slob got thrown away for 23 years or whatever that particular person's case may be. And so talking about faulty evidence, talking about the slow grinding gears of the justice system, talking about police tactics, being as politically correct as I can say, talking about changes in law, talking about talking about things like systemic racism is a really hot button topic even amongst our community, because a lot of people would say, well, that's, there's a certain thing about virtue signaling there. It's not about the race of the person. It's about these other issues, and I get that, but at the same time, like, so for instance, the first 2 cases in the documentary are Kennedy Brewer and Levon Brooks, and both of those guys are African American males in a poor rural part of southern Mississippi, and of course you have white DA, white judges, white jurors, and in both of their cases, it's in to Kyle's point earlier, it's that we believe these myths about the justice system. It's kind of like the Law and Order understanding, Law and Order as in the TV show, the Law and Order understanding of how the system works, in that there's these different groups and they're supposed to represent both the people and they're supposed to be seeking justice collectively. The judge and the DA and the police and everyone's supposed to be working towards justice. But we know that's simply nonsense. That's not true. The judges and the prosecutors and they don't represent the people. They represent the state. It literally says that in the names of the court dockets, right? It's the state versus so-and-so. They represent the state. They don't represent the people. And so in those 2 cases, the cases that were put against these guys are paper thin. I mean, so in those particular cases, they were both convicted on bite mark evidence that has since then been discredited. But even if that was not discredited to this very day, that's it. They had nothing else on these guys. There's no DNA evidence. There's no witnesses. In a lot of the cases in the documentary, a lot of the people have alibis, but the state just simply chooses to say, okay, you have an alibi, but we don't believe that one. Well, if I have a room full of people that says, I'm sitting here doing this show, I couldn't have committed the crime, and the judge says to you, I don't believe you, I guess you're going to jail. I mean, what else are you supposed to say? And so, no, you think of myths like innocent until proven guilty, and the burden of proof and benefit of doubt and or beyond a reasonable doubt and those types of things. Those things are again bumper sticker slogans of a bygone era that absolutely do not exist in modern America. The DA And also, just as another random aside, in multiple cases in the documentary, because they're looking at the problems with the system, not just these cases, is you're looking at prosecutors that are just conveniently losing evidence and not turning it over to the defense.
Yeah.
You're looking at prosecutors that, prosecutors take an oath to the Constitution the way elected officials do. The prosecutor on paper is supposed to be responsible for looking after your constitutional rights, the same as the judge and the defense and everyone else in the room is. But again, we know that that's simply nonsense, right? No, they're not. They're only there to put you in jail. They're not there to find out whether or not you're guilty or innocent. They're there to
Right.
put you in jail, and
Right.
they will work to that end.
They're there to build a case. Yeah, it has nothing to
Yes.
do with trying to get at justice. The detectives and the prosecutors, they just want to build a one-sided case. And our system is supposed to be this sort of adversarial thing where both sides are doing their very best to build a case, but you'll often find that the scales are very, unbalanced. You have the cops and the prosecutors with all the state power, subpoena power on their side, and some defense attorney. Sometimes it's like a public defender who's just terrible. And I mean, these people we're talking about, like Kennedy Brewer, I think was in jail for 15 years. Levon Brooks, I think 16. Just insane sentences. And I often think about just like the people who we don't hear about. Like I was recently watching, there's another documentary on Netflix called Dream Killer about this kid, Ryan Ferguson, who was put behind jail. He's sentenced 40 years for a murder he very likely did not commit. There's no physical evidence. It's just based on two witnesses who later admitted they perjured themselves. But this kid, like, I think we're only hearing about his case because this high dollar lawyer took it pro bono and because his father was like a crusader for him. But how many other people just don't have that kind of support? Not everyone has a expensive lawyer to take their case for free. So I think there's, hundreds, thousands of people who are just languishing behind bars for decades, who are similar cases to these people who we now know about, like Ryan Ferguson, like Kennedy Brewer. But yeah, it's just, I just wonder how many faceless people are just, rotting right now.
Well, it's so interesting. So again, talking about the presumption of innocence and the burden of proof myth is that in multiple cases in that documentary, one of the few pieces of evidence against the accused was some type of a witness, and then many of these witnesses then recant their testimony.
Yeah.
But then the prosecutors, and sometimes it's not the same prosecutor. That prosecutor is retired or passed on or whatever, and it's a new DA. Yeah, exactly. That happens too. And the default position of the state is, well, if they're recanting, all that tells us is that they were either a liar then or they're a liar now. So we'll just assume they told the truth the first time. It's like, what? That runs literally counter to the presumption of innocence, right? Like if you literally have two different stories from a witness and one says they're guilty and the other one says I was mistaken or flat out lied or was pressured perhaps by the police into a confession, therefore I lied the first time. Their default position is ignore recantations. And which then leads to the next point is, again, the system is theoretically designed so that if a guilty person gets off, that's a shame, but you don't put innocent people in jail. But again, we know that that's a myth, and one of the ways that you know that's a myth is that theoretically the burden of proof is on the side of the state. The first go round, they've got to prove you were guilty. They can't just prove you're a bad guy. They got to prove you are guilty of this accusation. But then if you are found guilty, and once you're locked up and you're trying to seek appeal or you're seeking habeas corpus, the role shifts, and now there is a significant burden on your end to not just simply prove that the case was a bunch of BS. You now have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt your innocence. Not guilty, because there's a difference between not guilty and innocent. But if you've been convicted, you now have to prove your innocence beyond a shadow of a doubt. And in most cases, I mean, you have to be bringing new evidence to the court. Otherwise, they're just going to deny your appeal before you even step room in the courthouse. That nothing about what we've talked about so far says to me presumption of innocence, benefit of doubt, burden of proof. That in fact, if anything, it tells you in many cases your life, if you find yourself as one of these unfortunate people that you match the description, someone who saw someone running 50 miles away, you sort of match the description. And again, in many of these cases, the police actually had leads for who turned out to be the real culprit but they had another guy, so they just didn't follow up on those leads. And that not only don't follow up on those leads, but then just conveniently forget those clues when the defense is seeking that information. Like, oh, sorry, we lost that box of evidence. So I will say this. There's people who are opponents to us philosophically will say things like, well, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. That's a popular one you've heard. Or you hear, oh, so and so got in trouble, like a George Floyd thing. Well, if he wasn't doing nothing wrong, it wouldn't have happened to him. Well, if you watch the Innocence Files, you see a ton of guys who didn't do nothing wrong, and it all happened to them, didn't it? To the tune of decades of their lives wasted. So if you still believe those things today with the internet and all of this information available, I'm sorry, you're evil.
Yeah. I mean, Kyle, I'll let you jump in just one sec here. But we've covered on the show a few different cases where, the cops just roll up to a guy sitting on his own porch and accuse him of something and say, "Do you live here?" He says yes, and then they don't believe him and they just kick his ass right there on the spot and arrest him. Another case, a 13-year-old kid is pressured into saying that he shot somebody because the cops say that his mother testified against him. His mother identified him as a shooter when it was the total opposite. So yeah, it's absolutely just not true that, oh, if you're not doing anything wrong, then they're not going to come get you, because the cops are very interested in, oftentimes they want to put, point blame at somebody, and they'll pick someone.
It's amazing that you hear people say things like, oh, the whole system, government, everything, the whole state, it's of the people, by the people, for the people. Well, what a strange situation, turn of events it is, that this system that is allegedly of, for, and by me can lie to me with impunity to try to entrap me. But if I so much as get a detail wrong to them, I'm going away at this point. Right. I've perjured myself, whatever. They can lie, cheat, and steal with impunity. And what's worst about it is not only can they do those things as just the natural course of their trying to pin convictions on you, but even in the situation where it is absolutely undisputed that there has been some type of law enforcement or prosecutorial misconduct. One of the stats from the documentary, we discussed it on the show last week, just in the last decade alone, there have been over 16,000 confirmed logged cases of prosecutorial misconduct in the United States. Do you know how many of them suffered any consequence? I mean, and a consequence can be a nasty letter, by the way. Any consequences at all, less than 2%.
Jesus.
That now
how many lost their job? I guess that's like less than 0.5%.
So I mean, we're market guys, right? We believe in incentives, and we believe in cost and profit, and we believe in consequences. They are absolutely incentivized to do whatever they can get away with to seek convictions, because they're not interested in justice. They're interested in finality. The case being closed is what they're seeking, not the case being solved. It's the case being closed. And so since they seek finality over justice, and since they are perversely incentivized to do this, and there's no disincentivizing, right? Like if 16,000 cases can be brought to bear and less than 2% of them suffer any consequences, then if I'm a prosecutor and I know that I have blanket immunity, and I also know that by the way, this is another systemic issue, since bringing up that scary word, systemic. If I know that as a district attorney, I have to be tough on crime and have a high conviction rate, because if I'm seen as milquetoast or, opening up my heart to the accused, then they're going to replace me. They're going to hire the next guy coming up out of the law ranks who says he's going to be tougher on crime than me, because people want justice, but what they vote and support is that tough-nosed DA who's going to take down whoever's across from in the courtroom by any means necessary. So the point getting around to that is that there's a definitive difference between a good DA and a successful one. If you're not a successful one, you go away. But if you're not a good one, you're an evil POS. But the system is designed to have this natural antagonism between people being ethical and moral and people keeping their seats.
Yeah. And to go along with, maybe, losing your job, because I think some like DAs and stuff end up being appointed, different counties have different systems, but even then, a lot of these DAs see it as a springboard to a promotion, like at,
Mm-hmm.
a state level position, or it used to even like be kind of a cliche in the US that, different congressmen made their bones as a DA on some high profile case or something like that. And that's
Or
how,
VP.
yeah. Oh yeah. Yep. A
Yeah.
bunch of
Prosecutor.
examples of that. But yeah, so that was one thing I wanted to mention. And then I think where you start this is the most powerful point of that documentary in the show that you had is, when people want to talk about systematic racism, they just want to look at the cops, right? They want to be like, oh, we need to get the cops better racial bias training, and that's going to solve these problems. And the problem is the systematic racism of police officers. And there may be like some police officers that are just like outright racist and who do commit crimes against black people because they can and get away with it. And then there may be like some like bias issues, but nobody wants to look up the chain at all when it comes to this. The judges and the prosecutors, the prison system, a lot of these people, a few in this documentary, but one I like to bring example to was Christopher Tapp, who was a young man who was wrongfully imprisoned for a murder, and the great Will Grigg was working on his case when not working as a lawyer, but working as a journalist on his case when he passed away. But this was a kid who everybody knew he was innocent, but he was gonna have to wait for a trial and could have spent 1, 2, know how many years behind bars. And also at the time, the state was signaling that they were going to take him to trial, even though it was pretty much assured that he was innocent. That later witness statements, different evidence that had come to light that this guy was definitely going to get off. But he had already wrongfully been convicted of the murder the first time, and they came to him. They said, I think it's either Alford or Alfred. I think it's an Alfred plea, and they say, here, if you sign this saying that you're guilty or you could be convicted, but you're saying that you don't do it, and so you're pleading guilty this way, we'll let you out of jail, but then you can't seek any recourse from the time you spent behind bars. And we're talking about, in a lot of these cases, multi-million-dollar settlements, which, by the way, all of us are paying for as taxpayers, right? There are victims to not to mention, if you lock up the wrong person, especially for a lot of these rape cases, the people who commit sexual assaults and rape lies that tend to do it again. And so you're, basically letting all these people out there and putting the wrong people behind bars. So there's victims piling up that way, but we're all paying out of our pockets every time one of these lawyers gets a case wrong. Will, in your state of Michigan, your fund for paying out wrongful convictions is bankrupt.
Yeah, that's right.
They're so bad at their job. They're right like a multi-million-dollar deficit in their payout system. So it's just absolutely crazy. But anything like you would like, I'll put a link to your most recent episode in the show notes page for people who want to listen to the whole thing. And Suzanne has such a great take on it because she was a former defense attorney.
Yeah, she was.
And so so she's seen the system and the worst of it. And man, if I think I could do a show with her without like going mad and like raging when we start talking about those things, I'll have to have her on sometime, Will. But anything else you have on that show?
Well, I was just going to say the last thing as a perfect example is in the Kennedy Brewer case. He was on death row. He was on death row, and from the time that 100% unimpeachable exculpatory evidence came to life, like it is now certain this guy did not do it. Right. Forrest Allgood, who was the district attorney there in Mississippi at the time, fought to keep him in jail for 7 more years on one technicality and crossed T and dotted I after another until finally they were forced to give him his appeal hearing and he was let out. That is unmitigated evil. That is evil.
That's what our vice president did. Speaking of her.
Yeah. We've done multiple. We actually did a series of episodes on the show called Kamala Cop. So it was like RoboCop. We had Kamala Cop 1, Kamala Cop 2, and Kamala Cop 3. And it's definitely a punch in the gut when you see people like that look, her record is not all sealed in boxes somewhere. Like it is, you can in 5 minutes in Google go look this woman up and see multiple cases where they prosecuted innocent people, and then when those people were found to be innocent, that her her district DA's office was fighting to keep these people in jail, and now that woman is the vice president of the United States. This wasn't something that magically came to light the day after the election, by the way. This is stuff that people could have known about her. It should have been the talking point that everyone was discussing on the street, and yet here we are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, originally it's what killed her own presidential campaign when Tulsi Gabbard said that and this stuff about marijuana and stuff. But Will, where else are we going? What else do we have to talk about here?
Just one last question to wrap up the criminal justice thing. I think you mentioned on that episode that you guys are going to be producing your own sort of miniseries on this subject. Tell us about that, or how far along.
So we're doing a 3-part miniseries. Probably on this week's show, I might show just the reveal trailer. Basically, it's really short and sweet. So I'm somebody who loves to come up with things that. Look, I'd go insane and rip my hair out if all I ever did was talk about rage porn, as they say. And so I tried to do things in such a way that it's informative, but at least there's a little tongue in cheek there too, just to keep me from going insane. And so I decided we're gonna play up that kind of law and order understanding of how the justice system works. And so we're gonna do a 3-part series that's a deep dive into, one being about law enforcement, one being about the court systems, that would be prosecutors, judges, and juries, and then part 3 will be kind of more the philosophical underpinning of where we come from, and that last episode being talking about reform versus abolition. Of course, as an anarchist, you guys would know that I lean more towards you just burn the thing down, as can't be reformed. It's not, Leviathan is not interested in our ideas about how the justice system can be informed, and it's going to be so. I actually already came up with the intro graphic. Everyone remembers from the 90s and on that Law and Order logo showing up and then turning red and blue, on the screen. So ours is going to be called Out of Order.
All right, awesome.
So we're going to do the 3-part miniseries, Out of Order. Part 1, law enforcement and policing and evidence. Part 2, the court system. Part 3, so what do we do about it? It's going to be that's going to be more of a rest of the summer type of a project.
Wow, that's amazing. I cannot wait to see that. Hell yeah. Now, I guess just to switch gears a little bit, sort of abruptly, let me see here. It's something we briefly talked about this, I think, off air, but this whole Wuhan lab leak theory that's been, making the rounds. I don't think we've actually discussed that on the show much. It's been sort of a major topic in the last week. Alan, I know you have a lot of, you have some interesting thoughts about that. Personally, I don't know where I stand on it. I've been, reading about the Wuhan lab since January 2020. I've been on, I've been hip to that for a long time. I still don't really know where I stand on it. I don't discount the idea that the virus could have escaped from this lab. Certainly is a coincidence that the only biosafety level 4 labs in this city where this virus happens to pop up. But another thing I know is that the China hawks really love this idea of the lab leak theory, and the intelligence agencies seem to be sort of endorsing it. So that makes me extra cautious. So where do you stand on all this stuff? Where do you come down on this?
Well, so I will say I understand that, and I don't have a lot of differences with the great Scott Horton, because he's fantastic obviously on everything, but particularly on foreign policy. But the only thing I would caution is that, it's kind of like the reverse of the enemy is my friend type of a thing of, my default position is to distrust the state. But if the state says the sky is blue, I don't say nuh-uh. That's because that's counterproductive. That's not being a critical thinker. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you. Obviously, I don't know how we got here as it pertains to the virus. I will say that it's not exactly a huge shocker that if you guys haven't talked about this, because if we had talked about this 6 months ago, we would have all been deplatformed, right? That's right. One reason why we didn't talk about it. But I definitely think that there's interesting. This is one of the many problems with the state apparatus as it exists, is that there are absolutely there are fair and logical questions to be asked, and I'm not saying I have the answers, but just there are interesting questions to be asked. But there's certain types of questions that, for one, the state's not going to answer for any, because they don't answer to you, right? They one of my good friends that I used to do business with back in my printing days is he had this really great phrase, which was, they don't even respect you enough to lie well. The state feels no need to discuss the origins of the virus with you. The Chinese state certainly doesn't, but our own doesn't either. The American empire doesn't either. So that's one thing. Um, but there's interesting questions such as, people, you hear this hot phrase of the gain of function thing, that look, this is a lab that literally does research on how to make things like viruses more contagious, more deadly, easier to spread, et cetera, et cetera. That's, by the way, that's a thing that exists on Earth, guys. Just FYI. They're like if you say the phrase biological warfare, that's like a really scary no phrase. Like, oh no, that's the worst thing ever. You can't do that. Only evil people do that. Well, why in the hell would you do any type of gain of function research if it wasn't for a reason? And if I'm trying to be as nice and fair as I can be, is that some people would say, well, sometimes labs do research into contagions that way for the reasons of health, that they want to develop vaccines, they want to develop medical treatments, and the way they do that is they grow this terrible, dangerous virus, and then if they can then develop a treatment for it, then now you market you obviously keep the virus locked up in the lab, you market the treatment. Let's just say, hypothetically, I'm willing to give that to you. I would be on the argument that type of research shouldn't exist. But let's just say, hypothetically, I give it to you that everything's above board and that's what's going on. They're researching gain of function. It's all a big accident, and they only have good intentions. Nothing about this was ever supposed to be weaponized. It's supposed to be so that we can develop better and better medical treatments. Let's say I assume that is correct. Okay, what came first, the virus or the vaccine? I'm not trying to be a dick. I'm just simply, that's a rhetorical question for the audience. Which came first? It's kind of like chicken before the egg. Which came first, the virus or the vaccine? I'm not even asking you guys for an answer. That's just an interesting question. Which came first, the virus or the vaccine? Because if this research is deliberately being done, gain of function research on contagions, then that seems like a big pharma medical industry ploy that in this particular case had devastating consequences. Another interesting question, I actually saw Michael Rechtenwald, if you guys are familiar with the anti-PC professor, he had raised and said that he was talking about, look, Beijing is like so many miles away from Wuhan, and they only reported something like 9 deaths and like 1,000 cases of COVID-19. And yet you look at, thousands of miles away in New York City, you had, 35,000 deaths and, 1 million cases. No. I'm sorry, that certainly doesn't pass the smell test. Now, should I be deplatformed for just simply wondering out loud to the audience? I wonder how that is.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not trying to say that I have answers, and I'm not pointing any fingers, because I don't know, and I try not to talk about things I don't know. But I'm just simply saying those are perfectly legitimate questions, and if you run afoul of a friend or a family member or a neighbor or a political opponent who just snickers at you and dismisses you for even asking the question, that's not someone I want to have a community with.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And Will, I remember when we first started doing our weekly shows together at the beginning of the COVID lockdowns, we were able to talk about this and it really wasn't an issue. And really all the way up until I would say April or May, we were talking about, and in fact, I think in April of 2020, we covered that article from Sam Husseini on gain of function research, where he was like, look, I'm not saying that this came from a lab. I'm just saying here, I think it was 10 to 12 examples of doing gain of function research in several different countries where people either got infected with the viruses or the viruses were able to leave. And I think he also highlighted the anthrax issue after 9/11, where it's very possible that anthrax came from Fort Detrick. So there's all that and that. Yeah, and we've talked about that and everything, but just because it's suddenly popular to talk about again, you're allowed to talk about it again, because I'm pretty sure if we had talked about this whole time, well, we wouldn't have still had our YouTube channel. There's no new evidence that we haven't covered from last year, as far as I can see. Now, there's a couple things in the Fauci emails where there's a little bit sketchy stuff going on, and certainly warrants more investigation, and we could find out some new information there. But they really haven't presented any new information that we didn't know from spring of 2020 about this gain of function, and yet suddenly everybody thinks it's true. And so, I really haven't changed my opinion yet. It's a possibility. But then the other interesting thing that nobody will talk about when they mention gain of function, you always have to couch in this language of, it was something that leaked out, or it was something that came from the, Wuhan Institute. And certainly it made sense that it came from the Wuhan Institute if it was a gain of function virus. And it seems like maybe Arkham Razor, the solution would be that it was like, they were looking to create some kind of new vaccine for a coronavirus, and they ended up making this terrible thing.
Right,
but it doesn't mean it wasn't it doesn't mean that it wasn't designed as a bioweapon, and it doesn't mean that it came from Wuhan. If it was engineered, it means that it was engineered, but that doesn't give you the location of it. And I mean, honestly, if we're talking about like biowarfare or something, wouldn't another country want to put it somewhere, or start the infection somewhere where there would be another source from a local area or something? Like, there's a lot of questions to be asked, and as always, the mainstream media seems to be doing their best to make, like, pigeonhole it and say, like, you could now believe it was engineered, but only if you believe it was an accidental leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And I think to contain ourselves to that would be very foolish. So yeah, that's what I had on that one.
Well, so and one thing, like, purely from like a geopolitical position, like from a foreign policy position, is that some of the things that have come to light is the evidence and the allegations that money. You were talking about taxpayer funds paying for these exonerations earlier in the show. That taxpayer money, because the government has no money, it only can tax and print and spend. That right. Some American money was funding Chinese initiatives into some of this research, yeah. And that just that alone. And again, I'm not trying to get into, there's, Dr. Fauci's literally sitting down with the CCP developing viruses to kill people. No. I'm not saying that.
He wasn't personally injecting the bats or anything like that himself. That's not it.
He showed up with the briefcase of cash and handed it to the shadowy figure of the CCP. Now, I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is that, boy, if the American empire is supposed to, because this is what we're hearing in the news now, like Russia kind of died down. Now China's the enemy. I'm sure we'll go back to being Russia being the enemy soon enough. But we're led to believe, if of course the corporate press is garbage, but the corporate press would have you believe that China is this major geopolitical rival of the American empire. And if that were true, then the American empire is really shitty at resisting its geopolitical rivals if they're handing geopolitical rivals money to do research with, right?
Bioweapons work.
Yeah, exactly. So while I obviously have no love for the hawks and the neocons, and if there's a neocon on Twitter right now, screaming at the top of his lungs, well, there should be more sanctions. We should be investigating China. They're the enemy. While I obviously don't agree with that, I tend to have the default position of World War III is not coming, because it's simply not in China's or Russia's or the United States or anyone's best interest to go that route, to have a major global conflict. Now, that certainly has never stopped global powers from having proxy wars and regime change in the poor sad countries that didn't have a big enough seat at the table. Right. But I still default to the position of, well, our Leviathan, the American Empire State, Leviathan has its tentacles everywhere. And so I feel like my takeaway from Fauci, from the gain of function research, from the Wuhan lab and all that, is kind of more of the Rand Paul takeaway, which is, you've got this group over here arguing that, oh, well, you're just being racist and xenophobic to accuse the Chinese, and you have this group over here saying, oh, no, this is a Chinese ploy. And I'm the one in the middle saying, okay, but why did we give them any money? I don't right. Either right. Group should be able to agree that, yeah, but they didn't, why, because I'm more of a region. Why are Tennesseans paying paying for the Wuhan lab. I don't understand.
Yeah.
Like, can get just that alone. I would rather get down to the bottom of that than get down to the bottom of where COVID-19 came from.
Sure. Yeah. And it is, just for the record, it is absolutely a matter of record that money did go from the National Institutes of Health. Specifically, I think Fauci's agency approved it. The National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease went to this American company called the EcoHealth Alliance, which then sent on some of that money to the Wuhan lab. And in those new Fauci emails, there is actually some kind of weird stuff where Fauci's talking to his top deputy at NIAID and saying, like, he sends him this study. It's a study about gain of function research that's the Wuhan. The director of the Wuhan lab is on the study. And Fauci is like, urgently sending it to his deputy. And his deputy says this work went on before the pause on U.S. government funding for gain of function. And he says another staffer is going to figure out if we have any distant ties to this work abroad. So whatever Fauci is saying in public about denying it absolutely unequivocally, he is in private concerned that possibly they gave some money to this work. So that is a matter of record.
If you tweeted that out last October, that would have been the last tweet you ever wrote.
That's right. I'd be under a sock account right now.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Alan, this has been absolutely great. We'll have to have you back on the show again. Anytime you got some news to talk about, hit us up and we'll have you back on the show. But tell people where they could follow you, where they could find your stuff, and where they need to subscribe. That way they don't miss that great 3-part series you have coming.
So every platform, everything is Alan Mosley TV, AlanMosley TV. So Facebook, Alan Mosley TV, YouTube, Alan Mosley TV, Odysee, Alan Mosley TV, Twitter, Alan Mosley TV, and Anchor. And so we're on all the podcasting platforms thanks to Anchor FM, and that's Alan Mosley TV.
Nice.
All right. Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on. Like I said, we'll have to do this again soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
I appreciate it, guys. I'll see you here on It's Too Late in a couple weeks.
All right. Sounds good, man. Thank you.